They say that Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed in a single night, by fire from heaven, by the wrath of the Most High. A definitive end, a land erased from the map of humanity. But if you walk slowly through the ashes, if you listen quietly as the wind sweeps through the ravines, you'll come to realize something even more terrifying than judgment itself. Sin did not perish with the city. The fire fell, the walls crumbled, the people died, but sin escaped. It did not remain in the ruined plazas or the collapsed temples. It slipped into the unseen crevices, into souls yet unpurified. It crept into the hearts of the survivors, lying still like a curse not yet broken. And then it came back to life. In the mountains, in the blood, in one desperate decision made by two daughters, born in darkness, survivors of chaos, who chose to preserve humanity not through life, but through fear. The two children born after Sodom were not a fresh beginning. They were the legacy of a sin that had never been dealt with at its root. They stood as witnesses to a truth that the official canon often leaves unsaid. Judgment does not end the story. It merely marks a turning point. And this is exactly where the Book of Jubilees becomes essential. A text excluded from the Western Bible. An ancient testimony given to Moses on Mount Sinai, but hidden from the eyes of modern times. While Genesis recounts the event, Jubilees reveals the principle. While Genesis describes the fire, Jubilees explains why it happened at that exact moment and what continued to live on afterward. Jubilees shows us time does not flow randomly. Every judgment follows a cycle. Every lineage carries a sacred responsibility, and sin, if not separated, purified and sealed through covenant, will continue to multiply, even under new names. The fire consumed the city. But if we do not understand the reason behind the fire, then perhaps Sodom will be rebuilt, not with stone, but with daily repeated choices. When the final flame extinguished, when the wrath from heaven had withdrawn, when the dust settled over the valley once bright with lights and music, one thing still lived. Not a city, not an idol, but the old nature never truly burned away. Lot was saved. He left Sodom with empty hands and an incomplete family. But he carried something he himself did not recognize, a part of Sodom imprinted deeply in the psyche of his household. Not in his luggage, but in his habits. Not in his possessions, but in his memory. His silence in the face of sin, his acceptance of comfort, his weakness in conversing with God, all created a void, which sin did not ignore. In that cave, meant to be a refuge from judgment, Lot's two daughters acted no differently than what once happened in Sodom's squares. No one forced them. There was no music, no pagan temple, only a distorted memory of how to preserve a bloodline they once witnessed. And so Moab was born. Then Ben-Ami. Two names that would become two nations. Two bloodlines not founded on holiness, but on confusion and a twisted heritage. Sodom had died, but its spirit had found a new body to inhabit. The Book of Jubilees doesn't stop at narration. It warns. It reveals that leaving a place does not mean leaving behind a nature. Fire may destroy houses, but it cannot touch the depths of the soul unless that soul is reborn through the covenant. And this is what Jubilees emphasizes. the necessity of a purification of bloodlines, not through fire, but through law, not through fear, but through the restoration of holy order within holy time, according to the holy calendar. Only when one enters the covenant, living by the feasts of the Lord, can the old memory truly be cleansed. The question is no longer, have you left the sinful place, but rather, have you been changed at the root, or have you merely escaped destruction, only to continue living the same way? When Lot looked toward the plains and chose Sodom for its prosperity, Abraham turned his back on the world and pitched his tent among barren hills, where there were no markets, no towers, only wind, earth, and God. The world calls him the father of nations. The Bible calls him the man of faith. But Jubilees gives him another name, keeper of the covenant. Not after he met God on the mountain, but even before the law was engraved on stone, Abraham lived as though he already knew it all. He kept the Sabbath, not because someone reminded him, but because his soul recognized the rhythm of heaven. He offered sacrifices, not by impulse, but exactly according to the days sanctified by the ancestors. He didn't just believe, he walked according to the sacred calendar. Jubilees tells us, in the year 2047 from creation, on the third day of the week of Shavuot, one of the consecrated festivals, God appeared to Abraham in the heat of the day, not at random, not because Abraham was special, but because he was in the right place at the right time, in sync with the covenant. And in that sacred moment, within the humble setting of a tent and a generous meal, a verdict was announced. Sodom would be destroyed. The irony is, Sodom didn't know it was a holy day. They were living recklessly, as they always did. But in heaven, the clock of God had struck, and Abraham, as a faithful watchman, heard the first echo of judgment's hour. That's the difference between Lot and Abraham. Lot lived by feeling, by sight, by convenience. But Abraham lived by the seasons of heaven, by the voice of the Spirit, by the calendar of the Holy One. He didn't need a government to legislate the law, because he lived as though the law had already been written into his bones. Perhaps that's why God did not discuss judgment with Lot, but with Abraham, because only those who know the breath of God will hear his voice before he speaks. When the two strangers entered Sodom, no one knew who they were. They wore no heavenly robes, no thunder, no flaming swords. They looked like ordinary travelers, but their eyes made Lot tremble, because his soul recognized something from heaven had stepped into a forgotten place. In Scripture, they are seen as angels carrying fire. But in the Book of Jubilees, they are more than that. They are not merely messengers of judgment, but keepers of sacred time, reminders of the covenant, warnings before it is too late. Angels in Jubilees don't wait until everything is ruined to appear. They are sent ahead to teach, to strengthen, to preserve the calendar, as silent witnesses of heaven watching every beat of human life. They carry no clocks, but they know when a generation has passed the limits of mercy. The sacred calendar in Jubilees is not just a timekeeping tool. It is the covenant's clock, where God appointed the times of festivals, Sabbaths, the weeks of Shavuot, as holy milestones to measure faithfulness. And angels, they are the ones who guard that clock. So when angels appeared in Sodom, it wasn't a reactionary rage. It was the final bell of a sacred timeline that had expired. Before the fire fell, there had been knocks on doors, there had been whispers in the spirit, there had been warning dreams, but no one listened. Lot met them, but only invited them into his house. He never invited them into his heart. The people saw them, but only as a new amusement. They knocked, not to teach, but to be violated. And by then, time had run out. The angels in Jubilees do not come to destroy mankind. They only destroy when mankind refuses to be saved. They are the final voice before heaven closes, the last light before fire rains down, the final call for those still awake enough to hear. Sodom was not a tent in the desert, not a poor nomadic village. On the contrary, it was the glory of the Jordan Plain, a prosperous, dazzling city filled with laughter and gold, streets paved with white stones, hanging gardens casting cool shadows, markets full of Egyptian spices, silks from the east, and slaves sold like cattle under indifferent eyes. People did not come to Sodom to pray. They came to invest, to entertain, to find freedom. Freedom from all limits, freedom from law, freedom from any sense of the sacred. In the eyes of the Sodomites, wealth was not just a goal, it was a belief, and that belief demanded worship. They built temples not to offer sacrifices to God, but to glorify pleasure. Their sacrifices were not sheep or bulls, but bodies, power, and anything that made man forget he was created to reflect the Holy One. Jubilees doesn't detail the architecture of Sodom, but when you read its context, you see a repeating truth. Every society that forgets the covenant begins to deify convenience. They no longer count days by Sabbaths, but by vacation seasons. No longer keep holy feasts, but throw festivals based on trends. No longer know what is clean or unclean. Everything is redefined under the name of freedom, and it is in that place that people called perversion a lifestyle, called deviation personality, and called rebellion awakening. But in truth, they were not awake. They were asleep in luxury. And when judgment came, they could no longer hear the warning. Sodom did not fall from poverty. It fell from wealth without gratitude, fullness without God, strength without justice. And what chills us is not the past of Sodom, but our own present. When wealth becomes the purpose of life, then the fire is not far. Lot was not a wicked man. He was Abraham's nephew, once pitched tents and built altars alongside his uncle, living the nomadic life under God's guidance. But when the land could no longer contain them both, when scarcity forced a choice, Lot chose the plains, fertile, convenient, crowded, and near Sodom. At first, he only pitched his tent outside the city. Then, little by little, like a shadow stretching with the sunset, he stepped in. Homes, family, relationships. He became one of them. Though his heart still held faith, his footsteps had drifted from the covenant. Jubilees doesn't detail Lot's story as it does Abraham's, but its silence speaks volumes. Lot no longer lived by the sacred cycle. He no longer offered sacrifices on appointed days. He didn't keep the Sabbath in a city that partied 7 days a week. He lived righteously, but only within the boundaries that society allowed, a righteousness bound by silence. He saw what was wrong, but he said nothing. He recognized distortion, but he did not correct it. He watched his daughters grow up in a defiled culture, yet still betrothed them to sodomite men. And so he gradually lost his voice, not because anyone silenced him, but because he chose comfort over faithfulness. And that is the most dangerous thing of all. It wasn't that Sodom made Lot wicked. It was that Sodom made him stop becoming better. When the angels arrived, he recognized them. But when he warned his future sons-in-law, he was seen as a joke. Not because he spoke falsely, but because he had never lived in a way that made his words believable. Lot is the image of a believer, worn down by silence. A man who kept the faith in his heart, but did not live it with his life. And in the end, he escaped, but carried with him a broken family, unresolved consequences, and a lasting lesson for all of us. Faith does not die on the day fire falls. It dies slowly in the years of living comfortably in darkness. In the eyes of man, everything seemed to happen suddenly. Disaster struck while people were buying, selling, eating, drinking, marrying. No warning signs, no thunder. But in the eyes of God, nothing is sudden. Every major event happens at the appointed time, not by man's calendar, but by the sacred one. The Book of Jubilees, chapter 16, reveals a crucial detail that Genesis leaves unclear. God appeared to Abraham on the third day of the week of Shavuot, one of the festivals sanctified since the time of the patriarchs, long before the law was given through Moses. And in that holy moment, where time and space merged in covenant, God announced the judgment upon Sodom. It wasn't a sudden outburst of rage. It wasn't an emotional reaction. It was a response given on schedule, like a heavenly clock chiming when mankind had passed the time of grace. Sodom wasn't burned for the sin of one day. It was because they had lived out of sync for a span of sacred time, rejecting cycle after cycle of the call to return to the covenant. Jubilees emphasizes time does not flow linearly as we assume. It turns in cycles. Every 49 years is a jubilee, a time to re-establish the covenant, a time for purification. If a generation lives out of alignment across multiple cycles, then a holy day becomes a day of judgment, and that is what Sodom forgot. They were not just morally wrong, they were off from sacred time. They created their own festivals. They invented their own calendars. They lived as if there was no schedule except one for entertainment, politics, and commerce. And when the bell of heaven rang, they did not recognize it as the covenant's clock striking the hour. So it is with us. If we forget the Sabbath, if we live out of season, if we lose the sense of sacred time, then we will live as though there is no hour of judgment. But God does not forget. He is never late. He arrives on time. The question is, do we still know what his time looks like? It wasn't that Sodom wasn't warned. It wasn't that God suddenly lost his temper. Before there was fire, there was word. Before destruction, there were awakenings, silent, patient, repeated, like a bell ringing in the night. But in a city that worshipped pleasure, that enthroned lust, angels were no longer seen as messengers, but as strangers. The Book of Jubilees says God sent angels to guard, to remind humanity to keep the covenant, to teach them to live in rhythm with sacred time. But what happens when an entire society turns a deaf ear to every word from heaven? when law no longer flows from the sanctuary, but from the marketplace where crowds cheer the legalization of sin. In Sodom, no one hid their sins. They displayed them as cultural symbols. They wrote them into law. They hung them on their doorposts, carved them into stone, and paraded them in festivals. Perversion became art. Violence became personal power. Depravity became sexual freedom. And anyone who dared speak of the holy was seen as outdated, blind, hateful toward life. The righteous did not die from fire. They died slowly under the mocking laughter of the crowd. Lot still held onto a sliver of integrity, but he no longer had influence. The angels appeared, but no one cared to ask their names. They were surrounded. They were demanded to submit to lust, and when they shut the door, that was the end of the final opportunity. Jubilees shows that when ears can no longer hear God's word, then eyes will no longer see angels. When society loses its sense of the sacred, even heaven's messengers are disregarded. Not because the angels came late, but because mankind had refused to listen for too long. And when sin becomes the new normal, then judgment is no longer an option, but an inevitable consequence. Because a city may live without morality, but it cannot endure forever if it has cut all ties to heaven. When fire consumed Sodom, many thought that justice had been done, that sin had been extinguished. But there is something more terrifying than destruction, when sin does not die, but hides and is reborn. Lot escaped the city. He had no more home, no more wealth, not even the wife who once walked the journey with him. All he had were 2 daughters and a cave, a temporary place in the mountains. A place he thought was safe, that he had escaped. But it was there, in that seemingly peaceful place, that darkness truly began to speak. The 2 daughters raised in Sodom, fed by distorted images, by festivals of depravity, by an education stripped of holiness, knew nothing of the covenant. Though their father was a righteous man, they had never seen a life of true holiness. They had only seen compromise, silence, and a faith too weak to keep the family from collapse. And then, in confusion and instinct, they did what even Sodom would recoil at. They made their father drunk and lay with him, one after the other. Not because they were more evil than others, but because Sodom had never truly left their minds. The city had burned, but its culture, its reasoning, its logic still lingered, manipulating thought, redefining morality, and justifying the unjustifiable. The Book of Jubilees in chapter 10 warns clearly of the consequences of allowing bloodlines to be corrupted, misdirected, not purified in holiness. Because if a generation is not separated from the memory of sin, then they themselves will become the source of new forms of the old. Moab and Ammon were born, 2 lineages, 2 peoples, not born of blessing, but of an act that should never be repeated. And from them, hostility against the holy people grew, becoming a fracture in sacred history. Fire cannot kill sin. It only burns the body. The mind, the memory, the nature can only be renewed when people choose to live differently. If not, darkness will quietly follow and be reborn in those who thought they had been saved. When the fire died and the ashes cooled, a new chapter of history began, but not a chapter of light. In the cave, where there was no call from heaven, no altar, no prayer, only the memory of Sodom and the fear of extinction, two lineages were born: Moab, Ammon. Two children who grew up without a grandfather, without a mother who knew the law, without a covenant to guide their path. They were the result of a distorted act, but more importantly, they were living proof of what Jubilees warns. Sin, if not stopped at the root, will be reborn in the bloodline. Jubilees 10:28-34 makes it clear the peoples born from improper mixing, from marriages with unclean lineages, from a lack of discernment between the sacred and the profane, will lead to moral and theological consequences that stretch through generations, not because they are automatically cursed, but because their foundations were not set on holiness. Moab and Ammon were not merely Lot's descendants. They became ancestors of nations hostile to Israel, waging war, drawing the holy people into idolatry, and offering children in horrific sacrifices. What began in sin evolved into systems, into institutions, into cultures that stood against the covenant. The judgment of Sodom ended a city, but the lack of renewal in the cave began a new crack in history. Not every ending by fire is a purification. Without repentance, without a severing at the root, the residue of sin will live on in generations that seem innocent. The terrifying part is not that Moab and Ammon were born, but that no one taught them holiness. No priests, no law, no memory of Eden. And so they continued the story, written in ink, stained by their parents' failures. Life, if not placed within the framework of the covenant, can become a tool to repeat sin. And every new generation born from unrepented mistakes is a reminder that judgment is never enough if the heart remains unchanged. We often think that destruction is the solution, that if fire falls, if evil is eradicated, holiness will naturally rise. But history shows the opposite. Sin is not stopped by punishment. It is only stopped by covenant. The Book of Jubilees emphasizes a profound truth. Only when a bloodline is restored to the sacred rhythm of God, living in holy time, keeping the appointed days, passing down the law, can the spread of distortion be stopped. Not through emotional lament, not through fleeting remorse, but through an ordered life rooted in the structure of the covenant. Abraham is the model of that truth. While Lot lived in Sodom, trying to maintain righteousness through silence, Abraham lived in the wilderness, but every day of his life was aligned with the rotation of heaven's calendar. He kept the Sabbath, not because of the Sinai law, but by the sacred intuition passed down from Adam. He offered sacrifices, not at random, but at the exact times appointed from above. That is why Jubilees calls Abraham the keeper of the covenant, one who not only believed, but lived as though every moment was sacred. And God, in a wondrous intimacy, called him his friend. The spread of sin doesn't come only from evil acts, but from the disorder of spiritual life. When there are no holy days, every day becomes empty. When there is no law, every choice becomes relative. And when there is no covenant, the next generation will redefine right and wrong based on the distorted memory of their ancestors. The covenant is not a burden. It is a sacred boundary that keeps darkness from going too far. It is a divine map that leads a family, a people, a generation back to the source of light. Sodom did not fall for lack of warnings. It fell because no one lived according to heaven's calendar. And what kept Abraham standing firm was that he walked each step ordered by God. You can choose to believe, but if you do not live by the covenant, that faith will fade with time. Sodom was a city that collapsed. It no longer appears on any map. No more watchtowers, no more markets, no more name among the nations. But if you think that means Sodom has disappeared, you're mistaken. Sodom is not just a location. It is a spirit, a lifestyle, a posture of the soul. And if you listen carefully within yourself, sometimes you'll find it still breathing, not among ruined streets, but in a meeting room where people agree with wrongdoing, on a phone screen where moral boundaries blur, in a joke that mocks the sacred, in a silent decision when truth needed a voice. Sodom comes alive again when the righteous choose silence for the sake of comfort, when parents no longer teach their children about holiness, when the holy day is replaced by personal schedules, when truth is traded away to keep the peace. You don't need to live among pagan temples to rebuild Gomorrah. You only need to abandon Eden within your own heart. Eden was the place where God walked with man, a place where time was sanctified, where law was kept through love. But Eden only exists when humanity walks with God, not with feet, but with choices. The question is not, has Sodom been destroyed? The question is, where are you living within your soul? You may live in a modern apartment, but if each day is led by lust, comfort, and avoidance of the sacred, then you are rebuilding Sodom, one compromise at a time. Jubilees doesn't recount the story to scare us. It reminds us that every generation stands between two paths, to build Eden or to repeat Sodom. No one is exempt. No one stands outside the scale. Every decision, even the small ones, tilts the balance of history. And you? Which way will you lean today? The fire is out. Ashes have settled on the ruins where music, wine, and laughter once echoed. Sodom remains only as a scorched memory on the earth. But in the silence, there is a voice few can hear. Not loud, not forceful, not thundering from the heavens, but a gentle whisper in the soul still capable of trembling. Jubilees reveals something remarkable. Judgment is not the end. It is the beginning of a new season. After the waters receded in Noah's time, God re-established his covenant. After the nations were scattered at Babel, he called Abraham. And after Sodom was burned, he did not go silent. The real question is, who still has enough inner quiet to hear? There are calls that never made it into history because no one answered. Not because God didn't speak, but because hearts had already closed. Survivors, like Lot, were too wounded to trust again, too weary to pray. And so they moved forward in silence, but without direction. In Jubilees, every judgment comes with an opportunity to re-establish divine order, but no one is forced. God does not rebuild through coercion. He calls, gently, tenderly, and only those who still carry a sense of the sacred will recognize that after the storm, the ground can still be seeded. After the ashes, the altar can still be rebuilt. Not everything burned is lost. What matters is, who will be the one to pick up the first stone and rebuild the covenant? Perhaps today your life has just come through a burning, a crisis, a failure, a season of ashes. But the question is not, why did it happen? The question is, can you hear the voice calling you from beyond the disaster? Because in every age, after judgment, there is always a voice waiting for someone awake enough to respond. There is a common misconception that God only destroys, that he gets angry, sends fire, closes the book. But Jubilees tells a different story, a story in which every collapse opens the door to renewal. A God who is not only just, but patient, not only cleansing, but preparing new ground to sow new seed. After judgment, the land lies in ruin, but the sun still rises, not to illuminate the ashes, but to light the way for someone ready to begin again. But no one starts Eden from zero. Every true restoration must be set into divine order. Jubilees shows us Eden is not a place on a map. It is a way of life, a rhythm of time, an atmosphere where holiness is the breath of daily living. In Eden, there are sacred festivals, holy rest days, laws written not just on stone, but into the lifeblood of the family. And it is this that makes a garden holy. When Lot fled to the mountain, he did not bring Eden with him. He brought memory, but memory is not enough to rebuild the sacred. Without the covenant, without the holy calendar, without instruction in the home, children will grow up not knowing what is clean or unclean, and Eden will become a legend, not a reality. But the beautiful truth is, you can begin Eden today. You don't need an angel to guard the gate. You don't need the breeze of Eden's evening. You only need to choose to keep one holy day instead of racing through every schedule. You only need to pray with your child instead of letting the world teach them life's values. You only need to train your heart to be still before God instead of living on reaction. Eden does not descend from the skies. It grows in the heart of the righteous, in the kitchen, in rest hours, in family conversations, in the decision to forgive, in the refusal to give in to temptation. And from there, light will return, not from fire falling from heaven, but from a small flame rekindled within you. Lot was saved, but did he truly overcome? He left Sodom with empty hands, bloodied feet, and eyes that dared not look back, because he knew behind him was a past turning to stone. But ahead, nothing was certain. No altar, no tent, no covenant, no promise, just a cave, and a silence heavy as mountain rock. Lot is the image of many of us, those who have escaped but have not changed. Those who were spared from a crisis, a toxic relationship, a defiled environment, but carried the memories, the habits, the fears, and kept living the same way in a new context. He saved his life, but lost his wife. He preserved breath, but not sacred life. His daughters were not raised in a holy household, so when no one was left to guide them, they acted according to what their former society had once taught as reasonable. And that is the most heartbreaking part. Lot had not prepared his soul for the day of salvation. And you, if you were Lot, what would you do differently? Are you living in a cave, a place where everything once collapsed, but you still have yourself and a few loved ones? You've escaped the wrong, but have you entered the right? Or are you still surviving, out of luck, not out of choice? Jubilees doesn't stop at punishment. It asks, after surviving, how will you live? And if there is no covenant, no holy structure, no new life rebuilt on grace, then every rescue is just a delay of the next cycle of destruction. The time of grace is still here. You are still alive. You can still begin again, not like Lot, but like Abraham, not in confusion, but in worship, not only with feet running from fire, but with a soul walking toward the light. Don't just be saved. Live like one who has truly been transformed. Moab and Ammon were not sin themselves, but they are living proof that sin doesn't need to stay. It only needs to be passed on. And if no one stops it, if no one stands in the middle and says, "From here, things will be different," then the mistakes of the past generation will become the identity of the next. You don't need to commit great sins to carry on a legacy of iniquity. All you have to do is nothing. Don't teach your children holiness. Don't keep the Sabbath. Don't pray aloud in your home. Don't speak up when society normalizes the wrong. Sin doesn't need you to create it, only to let it pass through you, unchallenged. Jubilees teaches this. What stops the flow of sin is not dramatic victories, but a generation that lives faithfully by the covenant. A generation that knows how to guard time, knows when the holy days are, knows when to offer sacrifices, knows how to avoid unholy alliances, knows how to live simply in a chaotic world. You can be that generation. You don't need to do something extraordinary. Just live faithfully each day, like Abraham. He didn't live in a temple. He lived in the wilderness. But he taught his family. He built altars. He kept holy days even when no one required him to. And because of that, he put an end to a sinful timeline and opened a new eternal covenant. The world today is becoming sodomized, quietly, each sacred value being replaced by compromise, each moral line blurred in the language of freedom. But you can still live against the current. You can still choose heaven's rhythm. You can still be the one to mark the covenant again, not with a signature, but with your life. The covenant never died. It has only lacked people to live it. And if you can still hear that call, then maybe you are the one who will bring it back to life today. Amen.